Get ready to dive into the supernatural world. Join Dr. James on his journey to uncover the truth behind a mysterious curse and face off against the devil's daughter. Will he find redemption or succumb to the darkness? Don't miss out on this thrilling adventure. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe to stay up to date on all the latest supernatural mysteries. Chapter 1: The Mysterious Arrival. Dr. James rushed to the emergency room as soon as he received the news of an incoming patient. He didn't expect to see a woman as beautiful as the one lying on the stretcher. She had long black hair, piercing green eyes, and full lips that were slightly parted. She was unconscious, and her body was covered in bruises and cuts. Dr. James examined her carefully, noting that her injuries were severe but not life-threatening. He couldn't help but wonder who this woman was and how she ended up in this state. As he worked to stabilize her, the woman suddenly opened her eyes and looked straight at him. Dr. James was taken aback by the intensity of her gaze. He felt a strange connection to her, as if he had known her for years. "Thank you for saving me," she whispered weakly. Dr. James was surprised to hear her speak. He asked her name, but she only smiled faintly and closed her eyes again. The rest of the night went by in a blur as Dr. James tended to the woman's injuries. He couldn't stop thinking about her and how she had made him feel. He knew he had to see her again. Chapter 2: The Devil's Daughter. The next day, Dr. James received a call from the hospital informing him that the woman was awake and asking for him. He rushed to her room, eager to see her again. When he entered, the woman smiled at him and introduced herself as Lilith. Dr. James was taken aback by her name and the mysterious aura that surrounded her. He couldn't help but feel drawn to her. As they talked, Lilith revealed that she had no family or friends and that she had been traveling alone when the accident occurred. She also confessed that she had no memory of her life before waking up in the hospital. Dr. James listened to her story with compassion and understanding. He felt a strong desire to protect her from harm. Days turned into weeks, and Lilith gradually recovered from her injuries. Dr. James visited her every day, and they grew closer with each passing moment. One day, as they sat together in Lilith's hospital room, she suddenly looked up at him with a serious expression. "Dr. James, there's something I need to tell you," she said. "What is it?" he asked, feeling a sense of foreboding. "I'm not human," she said softly. "I'm the daughter of the devil." Dr. James was stunned by her revelation. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. Chapter 3: Caught in a Spell. Dr. James didn't know how to react to Lilith's confession. He couldn't believe that he had fallen in love with the devil's daughter. But Lilith didn't seem to notice his shock. She simply smiled and took his hand. "I understand if you want to leave now," she said, "but I hope you'll stay and hear me out." Dr. James was torn between his love for Lilith and his fear of what she represented. But he couldn't bear the thought of leaving her alone. So he stayed and listened as Lilith explained that she had been sent to Earth by her father to find a human partner. She had been searching for a long time, and when she met Dr. James, she knew he was the one. Dr. James was skeptical at first, but as he looked into Lilith's eyes, he felt himself falling under her spell. Days turned into weeks, and Lilith's powers grew stronger. She could control the elements, summon spirits, and even levitate objects with her mind. Dr. James was fascinated by her abilities, and he couldn't help but feel proud of her. He loved her with all his heart, and he was willing to do anything to protect her. But as time passed, Lilith's true nature began to reveal itself. She became possessive and jealous, and she started to demand more and more of Dr. James's time and attention. Dr. James didn't know how to break free from her spell, and he felt himself becoming more and more trapped in her web. Chapter 4: The Warning. As Dr. James's relationship with Lilith grew more intense, he started to notice strange things happening around him. Objects would move on their own, and he would hear whispers in his ear when no one was around. At first, he dismissed these occurrences as his imagination, but as they became more frequent, he started to fear for his safety. One day, a stranger approached him in the hospital parking lot. The man was tall and imposing, with a stern expression on his face. "Dr. James, my name is Gabriel," the man said. "I've come to warn you about Lilith." Dr. James was taken aback by Gabriel's sudden appearance. He didn't know who this man was or what he wanted. "What do you mean?" Dr. James asked. "Lilith is not what she seems," Gabriel replied. "She's dangerous, and she's using you for her own purposes." Dr. James didn't want to believe Gabriel's words, but deep down, he knew that there was something off about Lilith. He couldn't explain it, but he felt as though he was being pulled into a dark and dangerous world. The next time he saw Lilith, he confronted her about Gabriel's warning. She laughed it off, telling him that Gabriel was a liar and a cheat. But Dr. James couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. He started to investigate Lilith's past, hoping to find some answers to his questions. Chapter 5: Uncovering the Truth. Dr. James spent countless hours poring over books and online archives, searching for any information he could find on Lilith's past. At first, he found nothing out of the ordinary. But as he dug deeper, he discovered a disturbing pattern of accidents and mysterious deaths that seemed to follow Lilith wherever she went. He also found references to Lilith in ancient texts and religious scriptures, where she was often depicted as a demon or a seductive succubus. Dr. James was horrified by what he uncovered. He couldn't believe that he had fallen in love with such a dangerous creature. But when he confronted Lilith with his findings, she simply laughed and told him that he was overreacting. "You have nothing to fear, my love," she said, stroking his cheek. "I would never harm you." Despite her reassurances, Dr. James knew that he couldn't stay with Lilith. He knew that he had to get away from her before it was too late. But Lilith was not willing to let him go. She used her powers to keep him under her control, manipulating his thoughts and emotions until he was completely helpless. Dr. James was trapped, caught in a web of lies and deceit. He didn't know how to break free, and he was beginning to fear for his life. Chapter 6: The Escape. Dr. James knew he had to get away from Lilith, but he didn't know how. Every time he tried to leave, she would use her powers to bring him back. But one night, as he lay in bed next to her, he noticed that her powers seemed to be weakening. He could feel himself regaining control over his thoughts and emotions. He took this opportunity to slip out of bed and make his escape. He grabbed his keys and headed for the door, trying his best not to make a sound. But as he opened the door, he heard Lilith's voice calling out to him. "Where do you think you're going, my love?" she said. Dr. James turned around to face her, his heart racing with fear. He didn't know how to respond, but he knew that he had to be strong. "I'm leaving," he said, his voice shaking. "I can't stay with you anymore." Lilith's expression turned dark and menacing. She raised her hand and summoned a bolt of lightning, which struck the floor beside Dr. James's feet. "You will never leave me," she said, her eyes glowing red. But Dr. James was determined to break free. He ran out of the room and down the hallway, his heart pounding in his chest. He didn't look back, but he could hear Lilith's screams echoing through the halls as he made his escape. Chapter 7: The Triangle. Dr. James knew he had to get as far away from Lilith as possible. He packed a bag and got on the first flight out of town, heading for the nearest airport. He didn't know where he was going, but he knew that he couldn't stay in one place for too long. He felt as though he was being followed, and he couldn't shake the feeling that Lilith was still watching him from afar. As the plane descended towards its destination, Dr. James looked out of the window and saw a strange formation in the ocean below. It was a perfect triangle, with no land in sight. He asked the flight attendant about it, but she simply shrugged and said that it was known as the Bermuda Triangle, a place where planes and ships had mysteriously vanished without a trace. Dr. James felt drawn to the triangle, as though it was calling out to him. He decided to rent a boat and explore the area, hoping to find some peace and solitude. But as he sailed deeper into the triangle, he started to experience strange phenomena. The water around him started to churn, and he could hear strange whispers in his ear. Suddenly, a storm broke out, and the boat was thrown about on the waves. Dr. James clung to the wheel, trying his best to stay afloat. Just when he thought that all was lost, a hand reached out from the water and pulled him to safety. It was Lilith, her eyes glowing red in the stormy night. "Come with me, my love," she said, smiling seductively. "Let us rule the triangle together." Dr. James knew that he had to make a choice. He could either give in to Lilith's temptation and join her in the triangle, or he could fight back and break free from her grasp once and for all. Chapter 8. The Temptation. Dr. James was torn between his love for Lilith and his desire to break free from her grasp. He knew that if he stayed with her, he would be trapped in a life of darkness and despair. But as Lilith beckoned to him from the water, he felt himself being pulled towards her. Her beauty was irresistible, and he couldn't resist her charms. He climbed down from the boat and waded into the water, reaching out for Lilith's hand. As their fingers touched, Dr. James felt a surge of energy coursing through his body. He was drawn into Lilith's embrace, and he felt her lips on his, hungry and passionate. For a moment, he forgot all about his fears and doubts. He was lost in the moment, lost in Lilith's seductive embrace. But as the storm raged around them, Dr. James began to feel a sense of unease. He knew that he had to break free from Lilith's hold before it was too late. He pushed her away and swam back to the boat, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew that he had made the right decision, but he couldn't shake the feeling that Lilith was still watching him from the depths of the triangle. As he sailed away from the triangle, he felt a sense of relief wash over him. He knew that he had escaped Lilith's grasp, but he also knew that he could never let his guard down again. Chapter 9. The Return. Dr. James returned home, hoping to put his encounter with Lilith behind him. He threw himself into his work, trying to forget about the strange events that had unfolded in the triangle. But as the days passed, he began to experience strange phenomena. He heard whispers in his ear, and he saw shadows moving in the corners of his vision. He knew that Lilith was still watching him, waiting for the right moment to strike. One night, as he was leaving the hospital, he saw Lilith waiting for him in the parking lot. Her eyes were glowing red, and her beauty was as captivating as ever. "Come with me, my love," she said, smiling seductively. "We can rule the world together." Dr. James knew that he had to resist her temptation. He stood his ground, refusing to be drawn back into her grasp. But Lilith was persistent. She followed him home, and she appeared in his dreams, tempting him with promises of power and wealth. Dr. James knew that he had to do something to break free from Lilith's hold. He sought the help of a local priest, hoping that he could exorcise Lilith's spirit from his life. Together, they performed a ritual to banish Lilith's spirit from Dr. James' life. As they chanted and prayed, a bright light filled the room, and Dr. James felt a sense of peace wash over him. When the ritual was over, he felt as though a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. He knew that he had finally broken free from Lilith's grasp, and that he could move on with his life. Chapter 10: The Revelation. With Lilith finally banished from his life, Dr. James felt a sense of relief wash over him. He was free to pursue his work and his life without fear of being drawn back into her grasp. But as he settled back into his routine, he began to notice strange occurrences happening around him. Patients with mysterious illnesses, bizarre accidents, and unexplainable occurrences seemed to be happening more and more frequently. Dr. James couldn't shake the feeling that something sinister was at work, and he began to investigate. His research led him to a startling revelation: Lilith was not acting alone. She was part of a much larger network of supernatural beings, working together to bring chaos and destruction to the world. Dr. James knew that he had to act fast to stop them. He reached out to other experts in the field, enlisting their help in stopping Lilith and her cohorts. Together, they devised a plan to trap Lilith and her allies in the Triangle, using a powerful combination of technology and magic. The plan worked, and the supernatural beings were trapped in the Triangle once and for all. Dr. James and his team celebrated their victory, knowing that they had saved the world from a great evil. As Dr. James sat on his boat, looking out at the Triangle, he felt a sense of closure. He knew that he had done what he could to protect the world from the supernatural forces that lurked within. Chapter 11: The Aftermath. The world was safe from the supernatural beings, and Dr. James was hailed as a hero for his role in stopping them. He was interviewed by news outlets and invited to speak at conferences, and his reputation as a leading expert in the field of supernatural research was cemented. But even as the world celebrated their victory, Dr. James couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. He knew that the supernatural beings were still out there, waiting for their next opportunity to strike. He continued to work tirelessly, researching and developing new technologies to help protect the world from the supernatural. His work became his life, and he devoted himself to it fully. But as time passed, he began to feel the toll of his work. He was exhausted, both mentally and physically, and he realized that he needed a break. Dr. James decided to take a sabbatical, to step away from his work and focus on his own well-being. He traveled to remote locations, seeking peace and solitude, and spent time with loved ones, reconnecting with the people who mattered most to him. As he reflected on his life, he realized that he had been so consumed by his work that he had forgotten to live. He made a promise to himself to live more fully, to appreciate each moment, and to savor the simple things in life. And so, Dr. James returned to his work with renewed vigor and a newfound sense of purpose. He continued to fight against the supernatural, but he also made time for himself, for his loved ones, and for the beauty of life. Chapter 12: A New Challenge. As Dr. James delved deeper into his research, he discovered a new challenge: a series of supernatural occurrences that seemed to be linked to a mysterious organization known only as the Council. The Council was shrouded in secrecy, and little was known about them except for their reputation as a powerful force in the supernatural world. Dr. James knew that if he was going to stop them, he needed to gather as much information as he could. He spent months researching and investigating, piecing together information from a variety of sources. He discovered that the Council was made up of powerful and influential beings from all over the world, with their fingers in every aspect of human society. Their ultimate goal was to control the world, to bend it to their will, and to rule over it with an iron fist. Dr. James knew that he had to stop them before it was too late. He gathered a team of experts from all over the world, each with their own unique set of skills and expertise. Together, they devised a plan to infiltrate the council and take them down from the inside. The plan was risky, but Dr. James knew that it was their only chance. They executed it flawlessly, taking down key members of the council and disrupting their plans at every turn. Finally, they cornered the leader of the council, a powerful being known as the Master. In a dramatic showdown, Dr. James faced off against the Master, using all of his knowledge and expertise to defeat him once and for all. With the council dismantled and the Master defeated, Dr. James and his team breathed a sigh of relief. They had saved the world once again, and this time, they had taken down one of the most powerful and influential forces in the supernatural world. Chapter 13: The Betrayal. Dr. James had thought that defeating the council would be the end of his struggles against the supernatural, but he was wrong. A new threat had emerged, one that would shake him to his core. One of his own team members, a woman named Sarah, had betrayed them all. She had been working with the council all along, and had been feeding them information about their plans and movements. Dr. James was devastated by the news. He had trusted Sarah completely, and now she had betrayed them all. He couldn't understand how someone could do something like that, and he was consumed with anger and bitterness. He confronted Sarah, demanding answers. She tried to justify her actions, telling him that she had been blackmailed and threatened by the council, and that she had no choice but to cooperate with them. But Dr. James wasn't convinced. He felt that Sarah had made a conscious choice to betray them, and that she was responsible for her own actions. He couldn't bring himself to forgive her, and he knew that he could never trust her again. Despite the betrayal, Dr. James and his team pressed on, determined to stop the council once and for all. They worked tirelessly, gathering information and devising new strategies to take them down. In the end, their hard work paid off. They were able to gather enough evidence to bring the council to justice, and many of its members were arrested and brought to trial. Sarah was among them, and Dr. James watched as she was sentenced to a long prison term. He felt a sense of sadness as he watched her being taken away, knowing that she had once been a valued member of their team. But he also knew that he had to move on. The world was full of challenges and threats, and he couldn't let himself be consumed by anger and bitterness. He had to keep fighting, no matter what. Chapter 14: The Final Showdown. As Dr. James continued his work, he couldn't help but feel like something big was on the horizon. He had a sense that there was one last challenge to face, one last battle to win before he could finally rest. And then it happened. A new threat emerged, a powerful and ancient being known only as the Guardian. The Guardian was unlike anything Dr. James had ever encountered before, a being of immense power and intelligence, with the ability to shape reality itself. Dr. James knew that he couldn't face the Guardian alone. He called upon his team once again, and together they set out to defeat this new threat. They traveled to a remote location where the Guardian was said to be hiding. As they made their way towards its lair, they encountered a series of obstacles and challenges, each one more difficult than the last. Finally, they reached the Guardian's lair. Dr. James and his team stood at the entrance, staring into the darkness. They knew that there was no turning back now. They had to face the Guardian head-on. The battle was fierce and intense. The Guardian was unlike anything they had ever faced before, and it seemed like every time they thought they had the upper hand, it would unleash a new attack that would leave them reeling. But Dr. James and his team refused to give up. They fought with all their might, using every weapon and strategy they had at their disposal, And then, in a moment of pure inspiration, Dr. James had an idea. He realized that the Guardian's power was rooted in its belief in its own superiority. If they could somehow break that belief, they might be able to weaken it enough to defeat it. With that in mind, Dr. James and his team launched a coordinated attack on the Guardian's ego, using insults, mockery, and ridicule to chip away at its confidence. Slowly but surely, they began to see results. The Guardian's attacks became less frequent and less powerful, and eventually, it began to shrink in size and stature. Finally, with one last, powerful attack, they were able to defeat the Guardian once and for all. Dr. James and his team stood victorious, knowing that they had faced their greatest challenge and emerged victorious. Chapter 15. Moving on. After the defeat of the Guardian, Dr. James and his team returned home, exhausted but victorious. They had faced countless challenges and threats over the years, but they had always come out on top. As they settled back into their normal lives, Dr. James realized that he had changed. He had always been a driven and focused person, but now he felt a sense of peace and contentment that he had never known before. He also realized that he had grown close to his team in a way that he had never expected. They had been through so much together, and had come out the other side as true friends and allies. But Dr. James knew that he couldn't rest on his laurels. There were always new challenges to face, new threats to defeat. He continued his work, researching and investigating the supernatural, always ready for the next big challenge. And then, one day, he received a visitor. It was Sarah, the team member who had betrayed them all those years ago. She had just been released from prison, and she wanted to talk to him. Dr. James was hesitant at first, but eventually he agreed to meet with her. They talked for hours, discussing the past and the future, and Sarah apologized for her actions. Dr. James could sense that she was sincere, and he realized that he had forgiven her. He knew that she had made a mistake, but he also knew that she was capable of redemption. As they parted ways, Dr. James felt a sense of closure. He had faced so many challenges and threats over the years, but he had come out on the other side stronger and more resilient. And he knew that, no matter what the future held, he would always be ready for whatever came his way. I know that some of the best story ideas come from you. Feel free to share your story ideas in the comments section below.